he stood over 7 feet tall. His hands could crush stone. His own soldiers claimed he drank barrels of wine and ate 40 pounds of meat a day. He was not born in a palace. He was not born in Rome. He was born in a Thracian village, the son of a peasant and a Goth. In an empire that worshipped lineage and tradition, this man had nothing except a body forged for war. His name was Gaius Julius Verus Maximinus. History calls him Maximinus Thrax, the barbarian emperor. He was born around 173 AD in the mountains of modern-day Bulgaria. His father was a Goth from beyond the Danube. His mother was a Thracian peasant. From birth, he was an outsider. He began life herding sheep, a life of isolation and brutal physical labor. Even as a boy, he was different. Ancient sources claim he grew to over 8 feet tall. His strength was legendary. He could pull a wagon alone, crush rocks with his bare hands, and defeat 15 trained soldiers in single combat. In 202 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus passed through Thrace, saw this giant shepherd, and recruited him into the army. For 3 decades, Maximinus served Rome. He fought in Britain, on the Rhine, in the east. He never lost a battle. And in 235 AD, the Roman army did something unprecedented. They took this common soldier, this man of barbarian blood, and raised him on a shield as ruler of the civilized world. The barbarian emperor had arrived. His reign would push Rome to the brink of total collapse. Thrace in the 2nd century was a wild and untamed land. Conquered by Rome but never truly Romanized, its people still spoke Thracian tongues and worshipped Thracian gods. This was the world into which Maximinus was born. His father was a Goth, one of the fierce Germanic tribes beyond the Danube frontier. His mother was a local Thracian woman. The land was harsh, the winters brutal. It was a place that produced hard men, and none harder than Maximinus. The historian Herodian, writing within living memory of the emperor, describes Maximinus as a boy of immense size and strength. He could outrun any man in the village. He could out-wrestle any opponent. He could carry a calf on his shoulders while other men struggled with lambs. Stories grew around him like vines around an oak. They said he could pull a fully loaded wagon by himself. They said he could crush stones into powder between his palms. Whether exaggerated or not, these stories tell us something true. Maximinus was physically remarkable, a man who seemed to belong to an age of heroes long past. In 202 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus was returning from a campaign in the east when his army passed through Thrace. The locals celebrated with traditional games, wrestling, foot races, feats of strength. Severus, a military emperor who valued soldiers above all else, stopped to watch. Among the competitors, he saw Maximinus. The giant shepherd dominated every contest. He threw stones farther than any man. He wrestled opponents to the ground with contemptuous ease. Severus understood immediately. He summoned the young man and enrolled him into the Roman army. Maximinus was 29 years old. He had never held a Roman sword. His journey to the throne had begun. Maximinus did not rise through family connections. He had none. He did not rise through political patronage. The Senate would never have looked twice at a Thracian shepherd with a Goth for a father. Maximinus rose through one thing and one thing only: violence. From the moment he joined the legions, he distinguished himself with acts of almost unbelievable courage. Under Septimius Severus, he fought in the Parthian campaigns, killing enemy soldiers with a ferocity that shocked even hardened veterans. His comrades called him the Cyclops. His enemies called him Death. Emperor Caracalla, the brutal son of Severus, recognized a kindred spirit in Maximinus. He made him a centurion, then Primus Pilus, the senior centurion of his legion. Emperor Macrinus promoted him further. When Severus Alexander took the throne, Maximinus became commander of the newly formed 4th Legion. For over 30 years, he served Rome. He fought in Britain against the Caledonians. He fought on the Rhine against the Alemanni. He fought in the east against the Parthians. He never lost a battle. He never retreated. By 235 AD, Maximinus was a general beloved by his men. He had risen from shepherd to commander through sheer force of will. The legions trusted him because he fought beside them, bled beside them, and never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. He shared their rations. He marched in their ranks. He slept in their mud. When a battle was lost, he was the last to retreat. When a battle was won, he was the first to praise his soldiers. In an empire ruled by emperors who had never commanded an army, the soldiers recognized one of their own. By 235 AD, Emperor Severus Alexander was in Germania fighting the Alemanni tribes. But Severus Alexander was no soldier. He was a young man, barely 26, who had been raised in luxury and ruled through his mother, Julia Mamaea. When the Alemanni attacked, Severus Alexander did not lead a counterattack. He sat in his tent while his mother negotiated with the barbarian chieftains. She offered them gold. She offered them tribute. In exchange, they would withdraw. The army was disgusted. Soldiers do not respect emperors who pay barbarians to go away. On March 18, 235 AD, the legions mutinied. It was a cold, calculated decision by men who had had enough. They stormed the emperor's tent in the middle of the night. Severus Alexander was dragged from his bed. His mother, Julia Mamaea, was pulled from her quarters. They were forced to kneel in the mud of the camp they had disgraced. And there, in the rain, the soldiers of the Rhine legions cut them down. The army had killed its emperor. They rejected everything Severus Alexander represented: civilian rule, senatorial influence, the idea that an emperor could govern from a palace while soldiers died in the field. The soldiers turned to Maximinus. He was the obvious choice. He was the strongest. He was the bravest. He was one of them. They raised him on a shield, the ancient Germanic tradition of proclaiming a king. As the shield rose, the army roared. They did not need the Senate. They did not need Rome. They had made their emperor. Maximinus was 52 years old. A man with barbarian blood, who had never set foot in the Senate, was now emperor of Rome. The Senate received the news with horror. They called him a monster, a barbarian, a cyclops. But they had no choice. They confirmed him. The barbarian emperor had arrived. Maximinus was the first emperor who had never been a senator. The first who had never held a civilian office. The first who was not truly Roman. The Senate despised him. They called him a barbarian, a cyclops, a monster. They whispered that he was too brutal, too uncivilized, too foreign to wear the purple. They mocked his accent. They spread rumors that he could not read or write. But the Senate's hatred was not about literacy. It was about fear. Maximinus represented everything they feared most. A man who did not need them, a man who did not respect them, a man who could rule without them. Maximinus did not care about Roman politics. He had risen through war, and war was where he intended to stay. He cared about one thing: the army. He doubled the soldiers' pay. He handed out lavish gifts to every legionary. He showered his troops with gold and silver. And to fund this unprecedented generosity, he did something that had never been done before. He systematically stripped the Roman aristocracy of their wealth. Senators, landowners, provincial governors, anyone with money became a target. Maximinus did not care about their lineage. He cared about their gold. Informers flooded the imperial court. Any senator could be accused of conspiracy at any time. There was no trial. There was no defense. There was only execution and confiscation. Property was seized. Families were ruined. Ancient fortunes that had accumulated over centuries vanished into the imperial treasury overnight. For 3 years, the barbarian emperor bled the Roman elite dry. The money went to one place: the army. He made them the wealthiest soldiers in Roman history. But he turned the entire aristocracy against him. While the Senate seethed in Rome and the aristocracy counted their losses, Maximinus did what he did best. He fought. In 235 AD, the very year he seized power, he launched the largest Germanic campaign since Augustus. He crossed the Rhine into the heart of Germania, leading his legions personally. At 52 years old, with gray in his hair and scars covering his body, Maximinus fought like a man half his age. He did not direct battles from a hilltop. He marched at the head of his legions, his great sword in hand. This was the emperor the army had wanted. In one legendary battle, Maximinus proved his reputation beyond doubt. The Germanic tribes, knowing they could not face the legions in open battle, retreated into a vast marsh. They believed the Romans would not follow. Maximinus did not hesitate. He dismounted, waded into the water, and led his men through the swamp. The water rose to his chest. His soldiers struggled to keep up. But the emperor pressed forward. When they reached the Germans, the barbarians panicked. They had not expected a Roman emperor to wade through a marsh to kill them. The marsh ran red. Maximinus had his victories painted on massive canvases and displayed in the Roman Forum. He wanted the people of Rome to see what a real emperor looked like. The paintings showed him towering over fallen barbarians, his sword dripping with blood, his face a mask of savage triumph. It was propaganda, of course. But Maximinus' propaganda was different. It did not show him as a philosopher or a statesman. It showed him as what he was: a killer. In Rome, the people looked with a mixture of awe and horror. The Senate saw only a tyrant. The hatred grew. Maximinus never set foot in Rome. He governed from military camps on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, far from the marble palaces of the capital. But his reach was long. His agents scoured the empire for wealthy targets. Senators were accused of conspiracy, executed without trial, their fortunes added to the imperial treasury. Provincial governors were stripped of their lands. Even priests and temples were not safe. The emperor needed gold for his soldiers, and he did not care where it came from. The message was clear. No one was safe. The executions came without warning. A senator might wake in the morning to find soldiers at his door. He would be dragged from his villa, accused of conspiracy, and executed before he could even speak in his own defense. His property would be confiscated, his family reduced to poverty, his name erased from inscriptions. This was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. And it was happening to dozens of senators, perhaps hundreds, across the empire. Maximinus did not even bother to attend the trials. His agents had their orders. For 3 years, the Roman elite waited and plotted. They knew that as long as Maximinus held the army's loyalty, they could not touch him. The legions loved him. He had given them wealth beyond anything they had ever known. He had led them to victory after victory. They would never turn against him, unless something changed. But the senators knew that loyalty could be bought. And they had something Maximinus could never give his soldiers. Legitimacy. They were the Roman Senate. In 238 AD, they found their opportunity. In March 238, the wealthy landowners of Africa Proconsularis had finally had enough. The confiscations, the executions, the terror, it had to end. They proclaimed the elderly proconsul Gordian I and his son Gordian II as co-emperors. Gordian was a respected senator, a man of ancient lineage, a figure who represented everything Maximinus was not. The rebellion spread like wildfire across North Africa. The African legions declared for the Gordians. The cities hailed them as liberators. The Senate in Rome, watching events unfold with barely concealed excitement, saw their chance. They declared Maximinus a public enemy. They ordered his name erased from inscriptions. They called on every province to rise against the barbarian usurper. Then, in a move that revealed their desperation, they chose two of their own, Pupienus and Balbinus, as co-emperors to lead the fight. In less than 3 months, Rome had 4 emperors. The year of 6 emperors had begun. Maximinus, still in Pannonia with the Rhine and Danube armies, had only one response. He marched on Rome. He gathered 40,000 battle-hardened veterans who had followed him through the German forests. They crossed the Alps in the spring of 238, their emperor leading the way. The Italian cities, terrified, opened their gates. But one city did not. Aquileia, a wealthy and strategically vital city at the head of the Adriatic, closed its gates and declared for the Senate. Maximinus was forced to lay siege. And in the mud outside the walls of Aquileia, the loyalty of his army would finally be tested. Aquileia was one of the wealthiest and most heavily fortified cities in northern Italy, a commercial hub that controlled access to the Adriatic. Its walls were thick, its gates were strong, and its loyalty to the Senate was absolute. When Maximinus arrived with his 40,000 veterans, he expected the city to surrender immediately. Who would defy the man who had conquered Germany? But Aquileia did not surrender. The citizens closed their gates, manned their walls, and waited. The siege should have lasted days. Instead, it lasted months. Maximinus' siege engines, built in haste, failed against the city's ancient walls. His catapults could not breach the stone. His towers could not reach the battlements. The city's defenders fought with desperate courage. They poured boiling oil on the attackers. They made sorties at night, burning siege equipment. Maximinus was furious. He threw more men at the walls, but the city held. Disease spread through the camp. Food ran low. Morale collapsed. The city refused to fall. The siege dragged into April, then May. And while the barbarian emperor sat outside Aquileia, something happened that he never expected. His own men began to turn. The loyalty he had spent a lifetime building, the bonds he had forged through blood and shared hardship, the devotion that had made him emperor, it was crumbling in the mud of northern Italy. The soldiers began to ask a dangerous question. Why were they dying for this man? The Senate was offering them gold to betray him. The whispers grew louder. Maximinus had given his soldiers everything. He had raised their pay beyond any emperor before him. He had filled their hands with plunder. He had fought beside them in every battle. But outside Aquileia, the legions began to lose faith. The siege had dragged on for months. Disease was killing more men than the enemy. Food was scarce. The Senate's promises of gold, delivered by spies, were tantalizing. The soldiers began to remember that Maximinus was a barbarian, a Thracian shepherd, a man never accepted by the Senate. They began to wonder if perhaps the Senate was right. The soldiers began to ask a dangerous question. Why were they dying for a man who had made them rich, when Rome itself was offering them more? The Senate had sent messengers through the siege lines, promising gold, land, and amnesty to any legion that abandoned Maximinus. The promise was impossible to resist. These were soldiers who had spent their lives fighting for pay. They had no loyalty to the Thracian shepherd beyond what he could give them. In the darkness of the camp, the whispers became plots. In late April of 238, the mutiny came. Maximinus was in his tent when his own Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to protect him, turned on their emperor. The sources differ. Some say he was killed in his sleep. Others claim he emerged to face his murderers, still believing his loyalty would protect him. One account says he knelt in the mud and offered his throat to his soldiers, acknowledging that a soldier's death was the only end fitting for a soldier's emperor. He was killed alongside his son, Maximus, a young man groomed to inherit the empire. He was killed alongside his son, Maximus. The soldiers cut off their heads and mounted them on poles. Maximinus Thrax, the giant shepherd, the barbarian emperor, the first common soldier to rule Rome, had reigned for 3 years. His body was left in the mud where he fell. His armor was stripped. His title was erased. The man who had terrified the Senate, who had led the greatest Germanic campaign in 2 centuries, was nothing but a corpse in the rain. The soldiers who had loved him now carried his head on a spear. The soldiers surrendered to the Senate. They marched toward the gates of Aquileia, carrying the heads of their emperor and his son on spears. The city opened its gates. The citizens poured out to greet the soldiers as liberators. The senators, who had been hiding behind the walls, emerged to claim their victory. They accepted the heads of Maximinus and Maximus, displaying them in the city's forum. The soldiers were pardoned. They were paid. They were sent back to their legions. The Senate believed the nightmare was over. The Senate celebrated. They decreed that Maximinus' name be erased from every inscription, every monument, every record. They ordered his statues torn down. They declared that he had never truly been emperor, that his reign had been a usurpation. They called him a monster, a barbarian, a cyclops. They congratulated themselves on their victory. They believed they had saved Rome from the Thracian shepherd. But they did not understand that the monster they had destroyed was the only thing holding the empire together. His death would not bring peace. It would bring chaos. Maximinus' death did not bring peace. The Senate's chosen emperors, Pupienus and Balbinus, had never trusted each other. They had been rivals before they were co-emperors, and they remained rivals after. Pupienus was a military man, experienced and stern. Balbinus was an aristocrat, cultured and weak. They could not agree on anything. They could not command the army. They could not control the city. The people despised them. The Praetorian Guard despised them. Within months, the guard dragged them from the palace and murdered them in the streets. The Senate, desperate and afraid, turned to the only candidate left. Gordian III, the 13-year-old grandson of the elder Gordian who had killed himself in Africa. They proclaimed him emperor, believing that a child would be easy to control. The boy was crowned, the imperial purple draped over his small shoulders. He looked terrified. He looked confused. He was a child thrown into a position of power he had never asked for. The senators believed they could rule through him. They were wrong. The real damage was deeper. Maximinus had shattered the relationship between emperor and aristocracy. He had shown that a man of barbarian blood could seize the throne. He had proven that the army, not the Senate, was the true source of power. And in the chaos of his fall, the empire's borders collapsed. The Alemanni poured across the Rhine. The Goths crossed the Danube. The Sassanids pressed in the east. Provinces declared independence. The empire fractured into 3 pieces. The crisis that Maximinus started, the crisis of the 3rd century, would last for 50 years. Emperors rose and fell like autumn leaves. Rome nearly died. Maximinus Thrax was not a good emperor. He was brutal, ruthless, destructive. His reign was defined by terror and confiscation. He murdered without trial. He stole without conscience. He ruled through fear. But he was also the most honest emperor Rome ever had. He never pretended to be something he was not. He never wrapped his brutality in philosophy or his greed in statesmanship. He was a soldier. He fought. He bled. He gave his men everything. And in the end, his own men repaid him with a sword in the throat. The senators who despised him wrote the history. They called him a monster, a barbarian, a cyclops. They erased his name from monuments. They pulled down his statues. They declared that he had never truly been emperor. They made sure the world would remember only their version of him, the version that justified their fear, their hatred, their betrayal. And for 2,000 years, that version has endured. Maximinus Thrax is remembered as the barbarian who almost destroyed Rome. But a Thracian shepherd becoming emperor? That is not a monster. That is a warning Rome ignored until it was too late. Maximinus Thrax was not the disease. He was the symptom. The disease was an empire that had forgotten how to choose its leaders, an aristocracy that had abandoned the legions, a system that could no longer produce rulers worthy of the name. The senators who murdered Maximinus believed they were saving Rome. Instead, they unleashed 50 years of chaos. They destroyed the last man strong enough to hold the empire together. Maximinus Thrax died in the mud, his head on a pole. But he was exactly what Rome made him. And his death unleashed the storm that nearly destroyed the empire he had fought so hard to protect.